Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back into a world of flickering torchlight, clanking metal, and some of the most baffling artistic choices ever made by bored monks in drafty monasteries. Imagine you are standing in the middle of a muddy field in 14th century France, wrapped in layers of wool and steel, ready to face a fire breathing dragon or a rival lord, only to find that your greatest adversary in the local folklore is a garden snail. Yes, a tiny, slimy creature carrying its house on its back. It sounds like a fever dream, but for a medieval knight, the struggle was real, at least on the margins of their prayer books. You're likely thinking that between the lack of antibiotics and the constant threat of the plague, you probably wouldn't survive a single weekend in this era. And honestly, you're right. The hygiene alone would be a boss fight. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop a comment below. It helps keep the fire burning in this little digital tavern. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel the weight of the hauberk, that's your heavy chainmail shirt, pressing down on your shoulders as you lean over a wooden desk. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax candles and old parchment. You aren't a knight just yet. In this moment, you are a scribe, a humble monk with ink-stained fingers, painstakingly decorating the edges of a Bible. But as you look at the sketches your predecessor left behind, you see them. Knights, fully armored, kneeling in absolute terror before a snail. It's a common historical fact that these marginalia, the doodles in the margins of medieval manuscripts, are filled with these bizarre battles. You see a brave warrior dropping his sword, his face twisted in a silent scream, while a snail with giant waving antennas stares him down from a cabbage leaf. It's one of those strange facts that keeps historians up at night. Why on earth would a class of elite killers be depicted losing a fight to a mollusk? Some scholars believe it was a jab at the Lombards, a group often stereotyped as cowardly by their contemporaries, while others think it represents the inevitable triumph of time and nature over human ego. You run your finger over the rough texture of the vellum, feeling the slight indentation of the ink. Historians still debate the true meaning behind these knight versus snail showdowns, with theories ranging from religious allegories of the resurrection to just a very long running inside joke among monks who had spent way too much time sniffing ink fumes. You can almost hear the soft scritch scratch of your quill. The room is silent except for the occasional pop of the hearth. You imagine yourself actually stepping into that drawing. One minute you're a scribe, and the next, the stone walls of the monastery dissolve into a misty, rolling hillside. You are now the knight. The transition is seamless, like drifting from one dream into another. The steel of your greaves, the armor on your shins, chills your skin through your woolen hose. Every time you shift your weight, the metal rings of your mail coat rattle like a bag of loose change. It's an oddly rhythmic sound, a metallic ASMR that follows you with every step through the tall, damp grass. You look down, and there it is, a snail. It isn't a giant monster, it's just a regular, slow-moving snail, glistening with a trail of silver slime. But in the logic of this world, this tiny creature is a symbol of everything that can go wrong. It represents the slow death of a reputation, or perhaps the crushing weight of a mortgage you can't pay because you spent all your gold on a fancy horse that has a recurring cough. You find yourself hesitating, your hand hovering over the hilt of your broadsword. The irony isn't lost on you. You've been trained to charge into the thick of a cavalry melee. Yet here you are, feeling a strange sense of existential dread because of a creature that moves at a pace of about 0.03 miles per hour. It's like a medieval version of a modern-day existential crisis triggered by a low battery notification. It shouldn't be that scary, but somehow it feels like the end of the world. The mist clings to your visor, blurring your vision. You reach up with a gauntleted hand to wipe away the condensation, the cold metal clinking against your helmet. The world of the Middle Ages wasn't just about grand battles. It was a world of deep, quiet superstitions. You remember hearing the village elders whisper that snails were born from the mud itself, creeping out of the earth like tiny, armored ghosts. You breathe in deeply. the air smelling of wet earth, crushed clover, and the faint metallic tang of your own armor. It's a sensory overload wrapped in a slow motion package. You begin to walk, your heavy boots sinking slightly into the soft turf. Each footfall is a deliberate act of will. The knight's life is often portrayed as one of constant motion, but right now it's remarkably still. You realize that the snail isn't chasing you, it's just existing. And perhaps that was the real fear. In a world where you had to fight for every inch of land and every ounce of respect, a creature that just carried its home and stayed quiet was an affront to your entire lifestyle. You chuckle softly to yourself, the sound echoing hollowly inside your great helm. It's a dry, sarcastic little laugh. Here you are, a pinnacle of 14th century military technology, feeling judged by a gastropod. As the sun begins to dip below the horizon, casting long, orange shadows across the field, the colors of the world start to deepen. The green of the grass turns into a dark, velvety emerald. The silver of your armor catches the last rays of light, glowing like embers. You notice more snails now, dozens of them, emerging from the hedgerows. They aren't attacking, but they are everywhere, a silent, slow-moving army. It's a scene that feels both peaceful and utterly ridiculous. You decide to sheath your sword. There's no glory in a massacre of mollusks, and besides, your armor is starting to feel like a lead blanket. The exhaustion of the day is finally catching up to you, a heavy, warm sensation that starts in your toes and slowly works its way up to your head. You find a dry patch of ground beneath an ancient oak tree, its branches reaching out like gnarled fingers against the twilight sky. The bark is rough and reassuring against your back as you slide down to sit. The clatter of your armor as you settle is the final note in this evening's symphony. You watch the snails continue their journey, undisturbed by your presence. The world is turning. The stars are beginning to peek through the canopy, and for a moment, the fears of the medieval mind, the snails, the demons in the dark, the shifting borders of empires, all feel very far away. You close your eyes, letting the rhythmic sound of your own breathing sync up with the rustle of the leaves above. The heavy dampness of the night air acts like a cool compress on your forehead, drawing out the heat of a long day spent in the sun. You aren't just a knight or a monk or a traveler. You are just a part of the landscape now, sinking slowly into the quiet history of the earth. The dampness of the ground begins to seep through your woolen hosen, a reminder that while plate armor makes you look like a god of war, it has the thermal regulation of a tin can left in the rain. You decide it's time to stand up, but standing up in full kit is less of a graceful rise and more of a multi-stage engineering project. You grunt, pushing off the trunk of the oak, your joints popping in a loud protest that rivals the creaking of your leather straps. This is the reality of the 14th century elite. You spend half your life looking majestic and the other half smelling like a wet dog trapped in a hardware store. Your feet, tucked into pointed leather shoes called poulains, are throbbing. It's a common historical fact that by the late Middle Ages, these shoes became so long and ridiculous that knights had to chain the tips to their knees just to walk without tripping over their own fashion sense. You haven't gone that far yet, but your toes are certainly questioning your life choices. The transition from the peaceful field to the rugged path toward the encampment is a slow, rhythmic trudge. Your boots sink into the thick, dark mud of the track, a substance the locals call ground, but you're fairly certain is actually a sentient soup designed to swallow expensive footwear. With every step, there is a distinct schloop sound, a wet, suctioning noise that punctuates the silence of the woods. It's oddly hypnotic. You find yourself timing your breathing to the rhythm of the mud's grip. Step, suction, release. Step, suction, release. You realize that if a bandit were to jump out at you right now, you'd probably just have to stand there and wait for him to finish his monologue while you worked your left foot free. You'd be about as threatening as a turtle on its back, though significantly shinier. Historians still debate exactly how much weight a knight could carry before becoming completely ineffective. But as you feel the 30 kilograms of steel pressing into your collarbones, the academic answer feels irrelevant. What they don't tell you in the heroic poems is the chafing. Oh, the chafing. Underneath your armor, you're wearing a gambeson, a thick quilted tunic stuffed with linen or horsehair. It's designed to absorb the shock of a mace blow, but its secondary function seems to be acting as a portable sauna. You are currently sweating in places you didn't know had pores. You imagine telling someone from the future about this, and they'd probably ask why you don't just take it off. You'd have to explain that taking it off requires a dedicated servant, a set of specialized tools, and about 20 minutes of awkward fumbling. You are effectively locked into your own vanity. As you trek, you pass a small, crumbling stone shrine by the wayside. Someone has left a handful of withered wildflowers and a few copper coins there. You pause, the metal of your neck guard, the gorget, biting into your chin as you look down. In this era, faith isn't something you do on Sundays. It's the air you breathe. It's the reason you believe that a piece of dried bone in a gold box can cure a fever, and why you're genuinely concerned that the owl hooting in the distance might be an omen of your impending doom. You reach out a heavy, steel clad hand to cross yourself, the finger plates of your gauntlet clicking like a beetle's shell. There's a strange comfort in the mechanical precision of your own movements, a sharp contrast to the chaotic, messy world of nature surrounding you. A mosquito lands on the small patch of exposed skin near your temple. You can hear its high-pitched whine, a tiny, annoying herald of the evening. You try to swat it, but your armored hand is far too slow and cumbersome. You end up just hitting your own helmet with a loud tang that rings in your ears like a church bell. The mosquito, unimpressed by your status as a defender of the realm, simply moves half an inch to the left and continues its meal. You sigh, a long, weary breath that fogs up the inside of your visor. You've faced sharpened lances and charging stallions, yet you are currently being defeated by a fly. It's a recurring theme in your life. The bigger the armor, the smaller the problems that actually get to you. The path begins to slope upward, and your lungs start to burn. You remember the sunscreen of the era, or rather the lack thereof. While people in warmer climates like Egypt used concoctions involving animal fats or minerals, out here in the European countryside, your best defense against the elements is just another layer of dirt and a very sturdy hat. You feel a trickle of sweat run down your spine, dancing through the quilted channels of your gambeson. It tickles, but you can't scratch it. You have to just endure it. This is the chivalric stoicism they write about in the Chronicles, though in reality it's mostly just being too tied up in leather cords to do anything else. Strange lights begin to flicker through the trees ahead, the campfires of your company. The smell of wood smoke drifts toward you, mingling with the earthy scent of the forest and the faint, sour aroma of horses. You think back to those snails in the margin of the book. Perhaps the monks were right to draw them. The snail carries its heavy home, moves slowly through the muck, and survives by simply not giving up. As you drag your mud-caked boots toward the light, you realize you have more in common with that mollusk than you'd like to admit. You are both just trying to get through the day without being stepped on by something larger. The sound of laughter and the low murmur of voices start to drown out the internal ringing in your ears. You see the silhouettes of tents, their peaked tops looking like giant pale mushrooms in the dark. Your squire, a young lad who is probably currently asleep when he should be sharpening your dagger, will soon be tasked with the Herculean effort of unpeeling you from this metal skin. You look forward to that moment with a craving that borders on the religious, to feel the cool night air on your damp skin, to stretch limbs that have been compressed for 12 hours. That is the true prize of the day. Not land, not titles, but the simple, quiet glory of taking off your shoes. You take one last heavy step out of the tree line and into the circle of firelight, the orange glow dancing off your breastplate as you finally arrive. The firelight dances across your breastplate as you finally slump onto a low wooden stool, the heat of the flames a welcome contrast to the creeping dampness of the forest. Your squire, a wiry boy named Elian, scurries over to begin the arduous process of the great unpeeling. As he fumbles with the leather laces of your gorget, you find your mind drifting back to those snails on the parchment. It's a funny thing about symbols. They have a way of sticking to your skin like the grime under your fingernails. In the high courts, where the air is thick with expensive perfume and even thicker lies, the snail has become a bit of a coded insult. You've heard the troubadours whisper that the snail represents the social climber, the merchant who, like a mollusk, carries his house on his back and moves slowly but surely into the territories of the nobility. It's a common historical fact that medieval society was obsessed with status, and anyone attempting to move up the ladder was viewed with the same suspicion as a pest in a cabbage patch. Elian grunts as he tugs at a particularly stubborn knot near your shoulder. You feel a sudden release of pressure as the heavy steel plate is lifted away, exposing the damp, salt stained linen of your gambeson. The cool air hits your chest, and for a moment, you feel light enough to float away. You watch the squire set the armor piece aside. It looks strangely hollow and fragile sitting there in the dirt. Historians still debate whether the snail combat imagery was actually a form of political satire directed at the Lombard bankers, who were often accused of being usurers. To the medieval mind, charging interest on a loan was a slow, slimy way to make a living, much like the trail left by a garden pest. You lean back, the rough wood of the stool digging into your spine, and let out a long, shaky breath. You're no banker, but you certainly feel the weight of everything you owe to this lifestyle: the constant maintenance, the physical toll, the expectation of being a lion when you mostly feel like a tired old dog. You look around the camp and notice your fellow knights also undergoing this nightly ritual of disassembly. Without their steel carapaces, they look smaller, more human, and surprisingly knobby-kneed. There's Sir Thomas, a man who can cleave a wooden post in two with an axe, currently struggling to pick a splinter out of his thumb. It's a strange, little-known truth that, despite the fearsome reputation of the knightly class, many of you spend your downtime engaged in remarkably delicate hobbies. You've seen battle-hardened veterans spend hours practicing calligraphy or debating the specific shade of blue used in a lady's favor. It's as if the sheer brutality of your day job requires an equal and opposite amount of gentleness in the evening. You watch the smoke from the fire curl upward toward the stars, twisting into shapes that remind you of the very heraldry stitched onto your surcoat. A heavy clay mug of ale is pressed into your hand. It's lukewarm and has a few bits of stray straw floating on the surface, but it's the best thing you've tasted all day. You take a sip, the bitter, yeasty liquid coating your throat. You remember a story a traveling friar told you once, that snails were actually the ghosts of failed crusaders, destined to wander the earth carrying the weight of their sins in a spiral shell. It's a bit of a grim thought, but in this world, everything has a spiritual price tag. Even the way you sit, the way you speak, and the way you treat your horse is weighed by an invisible scale. You catch sight of a small snail crawling up the leg of the table where the bread is kept. No one moves to crush it. It's almost as if, after talking about them all day, the creature has earned a seat at the table. The squire moves down to your legs now, unbuckling the greaves. The metallic click-clack of the buckles being released is the soundtrack to your relaxation. You think about the advanced tech of the Roman Empire series you heard a scholar mention once. Apparently, those guys had underfloor heating and paved roads that didn't turn into a vertical bog every time it drizzled. You look at your own mud-caked legs and sigh. You're living in a world of masterfully forged swords and intricate mechanical clocks, yet you're still defeated by a rainy Tuesday. It's a paradox of the age. We can build cathedrals that touch the clouds, but we haven't quite figured out how to keep our feet dry. The irony is as thick as the stew bubbling in the communal pot over the fire. Careful with the strap, Ilian, you mutter, as the boy pulls a bit too hard on a pinched bit of skin. He mumbles an apology, his face red from the heat and the effort. You aren't really angry, you're just tired. The exhaustion is a physical presence now, a warm blanket draped over your mind. You find yourself staring into the glowing embers of the fire, the orange light pulsing like a heartbeat. Historians still grapple with the great snail enigma. But as you sit here, slowly being freed from your metal prison, you think you figured it out. The snail isn't a monster to be fought. It's a mirror. It moves slowly because it has nowhere else to be. It carries everything it needs. It doesn't care about titles or land or the length of its shoes. In a way, the knight doesn't fear the snail because it's dangerous. He fears it because it's free. You finish your ale, the dregs tasting of grain and iron. Your legs are finally free of the steel, and you wiggle your toes for the first time in hours. The sensation is almost overwhelming. You feel the cool grass beneath your feet, a texture so different from the hard, unforgiving interior of a boot. The camp is settling into a low hum of snores and the occasional crackle of wood. You know that tomorrow you'll have to put it all back on: the weight, the duty, the steel skin. But for now, you are just a man sitting by a fire. You watch the little snail on the table reach the edge of a crust of bread, its tiny body stretching out with a slow, deliberate grace. You find yourself nodding in respect. We're all just carrying our shells through the mud, hoping for a bit of warmth before the sun goes down. With your armor finally leaning against a tent pole like a discarded exoskeleton, you are ushered toward the communal dining area, which is really just two long planks of wood balanced precariously on some barrels. The smell hitting you now is a complex tapestry of wood smoke, wet wool, and a scent that could only be described as aggressively turnip based. Your squire hands you a trencher, which is essentially a thick, circular slab of stale bread used as a plate. It's a common historical fact that these bread plates were often so hard they could probably deflect a stray arrow, and once you finished your meal, the gravy soaked remains were usually given to the poor or the dogs. You look at your bread plate and wonder if you qualify as the poor tonight, considering how much your soul craves a simple soft crust. Dinner tonight is a pottage, a thick stew that has been bubbling in a massive iron cauldron since midday. You watch the cook, a man whose apron has seen more history than most libraries, ladle a gray-brown mixture onto your trencher. It's a mix of oats, leeks, cabbage, and if you're lucky, a few morsels of salt pork that haven't turned entirely into leather. You poke at a suspicious-looking lump with your spoon. In this era, forks are considered a bizarre, slightly effeminate luxury from the East. You use your knife, your fingers, and a heavy wooden spoon that feels like a small oar. You take a bite, and the flavor is honest. It tastes of the earth, salt, and the persistent metallic tang of the pot. It's the kind of meal that doesn't ask for your opinion. It just demands you have enough calories to swing a mace tomorrow. There is a certain art to eating while trying to maintain your dignity in a linen tunic that is 3 sizes too large once the armor is gone. You notice Sir Thomas nearby, wrestling with a particularly stubborn piece of gristle. He looks like he's trying to subdue a small animal. It's a little known truth that medieval nobility actually had a very sophisticated code of table manners, despite the lack of cutlery. You are expected to wipe your mouth before drinking from the communal cup so you don't leave a greasy map on the rim, and you definitely shouldn't pick your teeth with your knife, unless you do it very discreetly. You find yourself carefully wiping your fingers on the tablecloth, which, let's be honest, is probably just a slightly cleaner piece of sackcloth. You've faced down charging cavalry, yet the fear of being seen as uncouth at a table of turnips is surprisingly potent. As you chew, your mind wanders back to the luxury of the Roman tech you've heard whispered about. You've heard that the Romans had fish sauce so pungent it was practically a biological weapon, yet they ate it on reclining couches. You, on the other hand, are sitting on a barrel that smells faintly of pickled herring, trying to convince yourself that this cabbage is a delicacy. Historians still debate the nutritional value of the medieval diet, with some arguing that the peasants' grain heavy intake was actually healthier than the meat clogged arteries of the high nobility. You look at the salt pork and decide to take the risk. A clogged artery sounds like a problem for future you, while current you is just incredibly hungry. The conversation around the table is low and weary. Someone mentions a rumor that the king is planning a new tax on windows, which sparks a round of tired grumbles. It's funny how, in any century, the two constants are complaining about the weather and complaining about the government. You find a small shriveled apple in the bottom of your leather pouch and decide to save it for dessert. It's tart enough to make your eyes water, but it cuts through the heaviness of the pottage. You think about the boring history for sleep episode on Forgotten Fruits, how the ancients had varieties of pears that tasted like honey, while you're here celebrating a fruit that looks like a mummified thumb. The irony is delicious, even if the apple isn't. A dog, a scruffy hound with ears that have seen better days, nudges your knee. You look down into its soulful, begging eyes. It's a universal constant. No matter the year, a dog knows exactly how to make a human feel guilty for eating. You break off a corner of your gravy softened trencher and toss it down. The dog catches it with a soft gulp and wag of its tail, the rhythmic thumping against your boot providing a comforting, percussive background to the evening. You realize that this dog doesn't care about the chivalric code or the symbolic threat of snails and manuscripts. It just wants the bread. There's a profound, sleepy wisdom in that. The torches are starting to burn low, casting long, flickering shadows that dance across the tents. The air is growing colder, and the warmth of the pottage in your stomach begins to radiate outward, making your eyelids feel heavy. You finish the last of your stew, the bread plate now a soggy, flavorful mess. You decide to eat the plate anyway. It's seasoned with the salt of the pork and the essence of the day's labor, and it's surprisingly satisfying. Historians often wonder if the medieval mind was constantly in a state of low-grade grumpiness due to the food. But as the heaviness of sleep begins to tug at your sleeve, you feel a strange sense of contentment. You've survived the mud, the armor, the mosquitoes, and the existential snails. A full stomach, even one full of turnips, is a victory worth celebrating. You lean back, watching the stars begin to sharpen in the black velvet sky, ready for the next transition into the deep, quiet dark. The transition from the dinner plank to your sleeping quarters is a journey through a landscape of cooling embers and the rhythmic, heavy breathing of tired men. You lift the heavy wool flap of your tent and step into a space that is roughly the size of a modern walk-in closet. Yet tonight, it feels like a sanctuary. The air inside is still, smelling of dry earth, old canvas, and the sharp, clean scent of the cedar shavings your squire scattered earlier to ward off the more ambitious insects. You look at your bed, a low wooden frame stretched with canvas and topped with a mattress stuffed with straw. It's a common historical fact that hitting the hay isn't just a colorful idiom. In the 14th century, you were quite literally sleeping on dried grass, and if you were lucky, it had been changed sometime during the current reign. You sit on the edge, and the straw crunches with a dry, papery protest that sounds like 1,000 tiny whispers. As you reach down to unlace your tunic, your fingers feel thick and clumsy. The temperature has dropped significantly, and the stone-cold chill of the ground seems to rise up through the soles of your feet. You think back to those Roman villas you've heard scholars describe, with their hypocaust systems pumping hot air through the floors. You imagine yourself standing on a warm mosaic tile instead of this damp dirt, and you let out a short, mist-filled laugh. It's a little-known truth that medieval lords would often sleep with a bed warmer, not a person, but a long-handled brass pan filled with hot coals from the fire, slid between the sheets to take the bite out of the frost. Since your squire is currently snoring loudly in the corner on a pile of gear, you realize the only thing warming this bed tonight is your own stubborn body heat. You pull a heavy fur rug over your shoulders, the weight of it instantly grounding you. Historians still debate the sleeping habits of the Middle Ages, particularly the theory of biphasic sleep, where people would wake up for an hour or two in the middle of the night to reflect, pray, or chat before falling back into a second sleep. You wonder if you'll wake up at 2 a.m. to contemplate the deeper meaning of that snail you saw earlier, or if the sheer exhaustion of carrying 30 kilograms of steel will keep you under until the rooster's first call. You lie back, and the straw mattress conforms to your body with a prickly, uneven embrace. It's not memory foam, but it certainly remembers every time you shift your weight. The tent walls shiver in a sudden gust of wind, the canvas snapping like a distant sail. Outside, the world is a symphony of soft, nocturnal noises, the distant whinny of a horse, the crackle of the watchfire, and the rustle of the forest. You remember a ridiculous rumor you heard in the barracks that snails were actually the preferred mounts of forest goblins, who rode them into battle at a very, very leisurely pace. You smile into the darkness. Your modern mind would call it a myth, but in this shadow-drenched tent, it feels like a distinct possibility. You find yourself listening for the sound of tiny armored hoofbeats, or perhaps just the slow, steady glide of 1,000 gastropods circling the camp. The darkness is absolute, save for the faint orange glow bleeding through the bottom of the tent flap. You feel your muscles finally begin to unclench, a process that feels like iron melting back into liquid. Each joint from your ankles to your neck seems to sigh in relief. You've spent the day as a rigid statue of war. Now you are just a soft, breathing part of the night. You close your eyes, and the lingering image of the flickering firelight creates dancing patterns on the inside of your eyelids. The thuyi-en, or relaxation you feel now, is hard-earned, a heavy, velvet curtain falling over the sharp edges of the day. You pull the fur up to your chin, the tickle of the hair against your cheek, a strangely comforting sensation. You think about the Boring History for Sleep episode on medieval textiles, how this wool was spun by hand on a drop spindle, each thread a testament to someone's patience. That patience seems to have seeped into the fabric, and now it's being gifted to you. You are no longer a knight with a mission or a man with a title. You are just a heartbeat in the dark, drifting on a sea of straw. The world outside continues its slow, ancient rotation, but in here, time has finally decided to stand still. You let your breath go, long and slow, watching the faint puff of steam vanish into the shadows as the first wave of deep, dreamless sleep pulls you toward the horizon. The straw beneath you shifts with a dry, rhythmic rustle as you roll onto your side, the deep shadows of the tent playing tricks on your tired eyes. As you hover in that hazy space between wakefulness and dreams, your mind drifts back to the strange drawings you saw in the monastery, those marginalia that seemed to defy all logic. It wasn't just the knights and their snail rivals. You remember seeing a rabbit, usually the most timid of creatures, dressed in a tiny tunic and wielding a giant wooden mallet against a terrified hunter. It's a common historical fact that medieval illustrators loved the world upside down theme, where the weak became the strong and the natural order was tossed into the air like a handful of grain. You find yourself wondering if the monk who drew those was simply bored, or if he was trying to tell you that in the eyes of the universe, your heavy sword and grand titles are just as absurd as a war bunny. The air in the tent has grown even colder, turning your breath into tiny ghostly plumes that dance in the dark. You pull the heavy wool blanket tighter, feeling the scratchy, honest texture against your neck. Historians still debate the true purpose of these bizarre manuscript drawings, with some arguing they were meant to be memory aids to help monks navigate long, dense texts, while others insist they were merely the 14th century version of shitposting. You like the latter theory. There is something deeply human about a man sitting in a silent cell 1,000 years ago, deciding that what this holy book really needs is a cat playing a bagpipe. It's a little known truth that these scribes often wrote tiny complaints in the margins too, like, the ink is thin or it is very cold, making them feel less like ancient statues and more like tired coworkers you'd meet at a modern office. You imagine yourself shrinking down, stepping onto the vellum page, and walking past a row of illuminated capital letters that glow like stained glass. You pass a creature that is half lion, half snail, its tentacles waving lazily in a breeze made of ink. Each step you take on the parchment feels soft and silent. The miyamai, or gentle irony, of your life is never clearer than in this dream state. You spend your days preparing for the great events of history, but your soul is fascinated by the tiny, nonsensical doodles on the edges. You realize that perhaps the snails weren't meant to be feared, but to be admired for their persistence in a world that is constantly trying to turn them into a snack or a metaphor. A distant owl screeches, a sharp, piercing sound that cuts through the silence of the camp. You don't jump, you just listen to the echo as it fades into the trees. In the Middle Ages, an owl's cry was often seen as a bad omen, but to you, right now, it's just a reminder that the world is still awake while you are resting. You think about the Boring History for Sleep episode on medieval bestiaries, books that claimed elephants had no knees and could only sleep by leaning against trees. You wonder if you'd be better off leaning against a tree right now instead of this lumpy straw. But then again, the elephant in the book was also depicted as being terrified of a small, squeaky mouse. It seems no matter how big you are, there's always something tiny and ridiculous waiting to ruin your day. Your muscles have reached a state of total surrender, feeling like heavy, warm wax. The earlier chafing from the armor is now just a faint, tingling memory, replaced by the overwhelming desire to simply exist in this stillness. You find yourself thinking about the deify, Keksuzavan Kontrenlotnvivik, or the things historians still argue about, specifically whether the medieval people actually saw their world as a dark, grim place, or if they were just as capable of finding light and humor in the muck as you are. Looking at the memory of those silly snail drawings, you're inclined to believe they were far more like us than we give them credit for. They were just people trying to make sense of a world where a head cold could kill you and the king could decide to tax your beard. The snapping of the tent canvas has settled into a gentle, rhythmic flapping like the wings of a large, sleepy bird. You let your thoughts unravel, the thread of your consciousness becoming thin and silver. The night, the scribe, the snail, and the rabbit with the mallet all begin to merge into a single blurry image. The logic of the daytime world, where things have to make sense and battles have to be won, is being replaced by the velvet logic of the night. You aren't fighting anything anymore. You are just a passenger on a slow-moving boat, drifting down a river made of ink and starlight. The weight of the fur, the smell of the cedar, and the soft crunch of the straw all conspire to pull you under. You take one last deep breath, feeling the cold air fill your lungs before releasing it into the quiet dark, ready to let the marginalia of your own mind take over for the night. The first tendrils of the pre-dawn chill begin to creep under your fur rug, and as you shift, you feel the distinct sticky sensation of your own skin. It's a common historical fact that being a knight isn't just about the glory, it's about managing a very specific, very medieval kind of grime. After days spent encased in steel and padded linen, your body has essentially become a laboratory for cultures that would make a modern biologist weep. You reach out a hand and feel a small wooden jar on the floor, your personal stash of knight's ointment. It's a thick, pungent mixture of beeswax, rendered mutton fat, and a dash of lavender if you were feeling particularly wealthy during the last market day. You rub a bit onto a sore spot on your forearm, the cool grease providing an instant, slippery relief against the friction burns left by your chainmail. Historians still debate the frequency of bathing in the 14th century, but despite the popular myth that everyone smelled like a dumpster in a heat wave, you actually care quite a bit about your presentation. You remember the boring history for sleep episode on ancient hygiene, where Romans used a metal scraper called a strigil to whisk away sweat and oil. You, unfortunately, don't have a strigil. You have a rough linen cloth and a bucket of water that is currently vibrating with a thin layer of ice. You think about the skincare routine of the elite, how some used rose water to mask the scent of horse, while others relied on the belief that a good, vigorous sweat was enough to purge the ill humors from the blood. It's a little known truth that medieval people often used dry washing, rubbing their skin with clean linen to absorb oils, which is basically the 1300s version of dry shampoo, just applied to your entire existence. You lie back, feeling the heavy grease of the ointment soak in. The scent of the mutton fat is admittedly a bit culinary, making you smell slightly like a Sunday roast, but the lavender adds a touch of sophisticated meadow to the mix. You imagine yourself in a high-end apothecary in Paris where they sell soaps made with ash and fat, scented with herbs gathered by moonlight. You chuckle softly. Even the best soap in the world can't compete with the reality of wearing the same gambeson for 3 weeks. You face down a charge of heavy cavalry, but the true test of your courage is the first time you take off your tunic in a room with other people. It's a different kind of battle-hardened. The tent flap shivers, and you hear the faint clink of a bucket being set down outside. That will be Elian, your squire, bringing the morning water. You aren't ready to face the ice yet. You'd rather stay here, wrapped in your greasy, furry cocoon, contemplating the miamai of it all. You are a pinnacle of society, a protector of the faith, and yet you are currently debating whether you have the moral strength to wash your face with a frozen sponge. There is a story that some knights used to rub their skin with onion juice to toughen it for battle. Though Keksujav and Kontrenlotnvik, whether this was a legitimate medical practice or just a very cruel prank played on new recruits. You decide to stick with the lavender fat. At least the snails won't be offended by your scent as you pass them in the field. The darkness of the tent is softening into a deep bruised purple as the sun begins its slow ascent. You watch a single spider spinning a web in the peak of the canvas, its movements precise and delicate. It doesn't need armor or ointments, it just has its silk and its patience. You feel a strange kinship with the spider. You are both just trying to maintain your little corner of the world. The Thugian you feel now is a heavy, waxy sort of peace. Your skin feels hydrated in the most literal fatty sense of the word, and the chill of the morning is held at bay by the sheer density of your blankets. You let your mind wander to the Boring History for Sleep segment on medieval laundry, how they used lye and chamber lye to get the stains out of white tunics. It's best not to think too hard about what chamber lye actually is while you're trying to fall back into a second sleep. Instead, focus on the rhythm of the wind against the tent. The world is waking up, but you are still in the margins. You are the knight in the doodle, currently resting between battles with mollusks and mosquitoes. You close your eyes again, the scent of lavender and old wool acting as a sedative, pulling you back down into the soft, dark earth where the history is quiet and the water is always warm. The morning light begins to filter through the heavy canvas in pale, dusty streaks, but you aren't quite ready to face the bracing reality of the camp just yet. Instead, your mind drifts to the memory of a local village festival you passed through a few days ago, a rare moment of leisure in an otherwise grueling march. It's a common historical fact that medieval life, despite its reputation for constant toil, was punctuated by dozens of holy days and festivals where the entire social order was briefly turned on its head. You remember the central square, a chaotic sea of colorful banners, the smell of roasting pig, and the sound of a lute being played just slightly out of tune. You, as a knight, were expected to stand with a certain stoic grace, but inside you were just as fascinated by the whistling competition as the local blacksmith was. You find yourself smiling in the dark of the tent, thinking about the sheer absurdity of medieval entertainment. There was a game involving a greased pig that turned the village's most dignified elders into muddy, laughing wrecks. It's a little known truth that medieval people were masters of finding joy in the mundane. When your primary source of news is a traveling friar and your primary source of light is a tallow candle, a man juggling 3 turnips is essentially a superstar. You remember watching a group of children playing with a buzz disc, a simple bone tied to a string that made a humming sound when spun. It's the 1300s equivalent of a fidget spinner, and you found it oddly hypnotic. You realize that while you are trained for the high-stakes drama of the tournament, your heart secretly prefers the low-stakes drama of a particularly competitive game of Skittles. As you shift on your straw mattress, the rustle reminds you of the dry grass in that village square. You imagine yourself back there, but this time without the heavy burden of your reputation. You are just a man in a linen tunic, watching a mummers play where the actors are wearing masks made of boiled leather. The Miyamai of the situation is that the play is about a brave knight fighting a dragon, but the dragon is clearly just 3 peasants in a painted sack. You find it far more entertaining than any actual battle you've been in. Actual battles are mostly just confusion, sweat, and the smell of wet iron. The play, however, has a hero who never gets a cramp and a dragon that occasionally stops to sneeze. Historians still debate the extent to which these festivals served as a safety valve for social tension, allowing the poor to mock the rich in a controlled environment. You remember a king of misrule being crowned, a local stable hand who got to give orders to the mayor for a single day. You watched as he ordered everyone to drink their ale while standing on one leg. It was ridiculous, and yet there was a profound sense of community in that collective silliness. Even the snails in the margins of the village's parish records seemed to be joining in, their ink-drawn shells decorated with tiny festive ribbons. You realize that the boring history for sleep isn't just about dates and kings, it's about the quiet, funny moments that happen when nobody is looking for glory. A soft, rhythmic thumping starts outside your tent. Someone is beating a rug to get the dust out. The sound is dull and comforting, like a distant drum. It blends with the memory of the village dancers, their wooden clogs hitting the packed earth in a steady, grounding beat. You feel your pulse slowing down to match that rhythm. You aren't in a hurry to get back to the steel and the mud. You want to linger in this mental village square a little longer, where the only thing you have to defend is your pride in a game of hoodman's blind. The tent is getting warmer now, the sun finally overcoming the morning chill. You think about the boring history for sleep segment on medieval snacks, how you could buy wastel breads soaked in honey or small pies filled with spiced eels. Your stomach gives a small, nostalgic rumble. You decide to stay in this half awake state, drifting between the warmth of your blankets and the colorful memories of the festival. The world of the camp will be there soon enough, with its demands and its heavy metal skins, but for now, you are the king of Misrule in your own quiet kingdom of straw. You close your eyes, letting the imaginary sound of the lute and the distant thumping of the rug pull you back into a soft, colorful daydream where the sun always stays at high noon and the only battles are fought with turnips. The rhythmic thumping of the rug outside eventually fades, replaced by the persistent low grade buzzing of a horsefly that has somehow navigated the maze of your tent flaps. It's a common historical fact that the medieval world was never truly quiet. Even in the deepest forest, you are surrounded by a microscopic army of monsters that no suit of armor can keep out. You watch the fly circle the peak of the tent, its erratic flight path a sharp contrast to the slow, dignified glide of the snails you encountered yesterday. You realize that as a knight, you've been trained to fear the big things: the sharpened poleaxe, the falling portcullis, the charge of a rival's stallion. But it's the tiny things that actually govern your daily existence. The itch of a flea, the sting of a wasp, or the slow, silent encroachment of mold on your leather straps are the real enemies in this long, grinding campaign of survival. You reach down to adjust the fur rug, and your fingers brush against a small, damp patch on the canvas. It's a little known truth that, despite the grand stone walls of the castles you frequent, the indoor experience of the 14th century is often just as buggy as the outdoors. You've seen noble women use flea traps, tiny silver or ivory cylinders worn around the neck, filled with a piece of cloth soaked in blood and honey to lure the pests away from their skin. You don't have a fancy silver trap. You just have your own resilience and the hope that you aren't as tasty as you were yesterday. Historians still debate the effectiveness of medieval pest control, which ranged from scattering aromatic herbs like pennyroyal on the floor to more optimistic methods, such as reciting specific psalms to discourage locusts. You've tried both, and honestly, the pennyroyal smells better, even if the bugs seem remarkably indifferent to your theology. This realization brings a touch of Miyamai to your morning thoughts. You are a man who possesses a sword that could cleave a shield, yet you are currently being held hostage in your own bed by the fear of a particularly large spider. It's the knight's paradox. The more you try to isolate yourself from the world with steel and stone, the more you notice the tiny things that slip through the cracks. You think about the boring history for sleep episode on medieval monsters found in the water. How people believed that every drop of a pond was filled with tiny invisible dragons and serpents. Looking at the fly buzzing near your nose, you're inclined to believe them. To a creature that small, you are a vast, breathing continent of wool and warm skin, a landscape to be explored and, occasionally, bitten. You imagine a version of those marginalia drawings where the snails and the knights are joined by giant armored mosquitoes wielding tiny lances. It would be a more accurate representation of your life than any epic poem ever written. Kaksuja van kon Treinlotenvevik, or the things scholars still argue about, specifically how much of the medieval heroic spirit was actually just a byproduct of chronic sleep deprivation caused by itchy blankets. You find yourself chuckling softly, the sound muffled by your fur rug. If the troubadours actually sang about the realities of camp life, the constant battle against the microfauna, the songs would be much longer and significantly less romantic. They'd be less about the clash of kings and more about the great scratching of 1348. The sun is now strong enough to turn the tent canvas into a glowing amber canopy. You watch the silhouette of a beetle crawling across the outside of the fabric, its tiny legs casting long, spindly shadows. It looks like a miniature heraldic beast, a ghoul's beetle rampant on a field of sun-bleached canvas. There's a strange, ASMR-like peace in watching its slow, deliberate progress. It has its own mission, its own heavy shell to carry, and it is completely oblivious to the fact that it is currently walking across the ceiling of a man who could crush it without waking up. You decide to grant it safe passage. In a world full of lances and taxes, the least you can do is let a beetle finish its morning commute. The warmth is making you feel heavy again, a pleasant, syrupy languor that starts in your limbs and settles in your chest. You decide that the tiny monsters can wait. The fly has finally landed on a tent pole, seemingly exhausted by its own buzzing. The beetle has disappeared over the ridge of the roof. The world is at a stalemate. You pull the fur rug up over your ears, creating a small, silent cave where the only sound is the rhythmic thrum of your own heart. You aren't a warrior right now. You are just a part of the ecosystem, a large, warm rock for the insects to navigate around. You close your eyes, letting the golden light of the tent fade into a soft, buzzing darkness, drifting back into the quiet history where the smallest creatures are the true kings of the realm. The golden glow of the tent ceiling begins to shift into a deeper, richer amber as a cloud passes over the sun, and your mind drifts from the tiny beetles on the canvas to the grand, intricate tapestries you've seen hanging in the great halls of the north. It's a common historical fact that in this era, a tapestry wasn't just a piece of art, it was the insulation of the elite. Without those heavy, woven scenes of hunts and battles covering the cold stone walls, a castle would have the internal climate of a meat locker. You imagine yourself standing before one of these massive hangings, your fingers tracing the thousands of tiny silk and wool stitches that form the image of a lady sitting in a walled garden. There is a hidden language in these threads, a Mia Mai that only those who live in the margins can truly read. You recall a specific tapestry where a knight is depicted slaying a dragon, but if you look closely at the background, in a tiny corner near a woven oak tree, there is a small snail climbing a blade of grass, completely ignored by the hero. It's a little known truth that the women who spent years weaving these masterpieces often hid their own jokes and personal messages in the scenery. Perhaps the weaver was tired of hearing about the knight's bravery and decided to give the snail the last laugh. You think about the boring history for sleep segment on medieval symbolism, how a unicorn represented purity, a dog represented loyalty, and a rabbit, well, we already know the rabbits were busy with their mallets. Each stitch was a silent word, a slow motion conversation between the maker and whoever was patient enough to look. The air in the tent remains still, and you find yourself imagining the physical sensation of weaving, the rhythmic clack thud of the loom, the repetitive motion of the shuttle passing back and forth like a heartbeat. It's a deeply meditative thought. Historians still debate the millennium of the loom, arguing that the transition from vertical to horizontal looms was one of the most significant technological leaps for the medieval economy. Yet to the person actually sitting at the machine, it was just a long, quiet day of counting threads. You find your own breathing becoming rhythmic, matching the imaginary movement of the shuttle, in and out, left and right. You are weaving your own rest out of the memories of the day. You remember hearing a story about a queen who used her embroidery to send coded messages to her allies while she was held in honorable captivity. Every flower, every bird, and every snail was a piece of a puzzle. It's a beautiful, quiet way to wage a war. You think about your own life. How much of what you do is just embroidery? For the sake of appearances, your polished armor, your heraldic shield, the way you sit your horse, it's all a carefully woven image. But here, in the dim light of your tent, the threads are loose. You aren't a symbol. You are just the raw wool, unspun and comfortable. The shadow of a bird flickers across the tent roof, its wings momentarily darkening the amber light. It reminds you of a hawk embroidered on a noble's sleeve, frozen in mid-flight for eternity. You prefer the real bird, the one that can actually fly away. There is a certain miyamai in spending a fortune to have a picture of nature on your wall while you're busy building walls to keep nature out. You let out a soft, sleepy huff of amusement. Humans are such strange, contradictory creatures, especially when they have enough gold to be bored. The warmth of the tent is now a heavy physical weight. like one of those very tapestries has been laid over you. You feel yourself sinking deeper into the straw, the texture of the stalks through the canvas feeling like the rough underside of a woven rug. Kaksujavan kontrengluan vivik, whether the lady and the unicorn tapestries were actually about the five senses. But right now, your sixth sense, the one that knows exactly when it's time to stop thinking, is taking over. The world of symbols, hidden meanings, and silent messages is fading. You don't need to decode the threads anymore. You just need to be part of the weave. You close your eyes, the image of 1,000 tiny silk snails dancing behind your lids, each one carrying a tiny secret into the quiet, woven dark. The amber light in the tent begins to haze as a thin, acrid scent drifts through the canvas, the unmistakable smell of wood smoke and damp soot. It's a common historical fact that while the Middle Ages looked majestic in tapestries, it was a world that existed in a constant state of being slightly on fire. You shift your head on your straw-filled pillow, feeling the sting in your eyes that comes from a night spent in a space where the ventilation is more of a suggestion than a reality. In this era, the chimney is still a bit of a high-tech novelty. In many halls and tents, you simply have a central hearth and a hole in the roof, which works perfectly well as long as the wind isn't blowing, which in your experience it always is. You imagine the Miyamai of a grand duke sitting on a gilded throne draped in ermine while he coughs his lungs out because the draft sent a cloud of oak smoke directly into his face. You look toward the tent flap where a small, wispy finger of gray smoke has managed to sneak inside. It curls and twists in the dim light, looking like the ghostly antennas of a giant celestial snail. Historians still debate the evolution of the medieval fireplace, noting that the transition from the smoke hole to the wall-mounted chimney changed everything from architecture to how people socialized. But for you, currently huddled under a fur rug, it just means your hair is going to smell like a smoked ham for the next 3 days. There is a little-known truth that medieval people often suffered from chronic respiratory issues and red eye, simply because they spent their winters huddling as close to the fire as possible. You've faced lances and arrows, but the most persistent threat to your comfort is a poorly seasoned log. You think back to those Roman ruins you passed near the coast, the skeletons of villas that once had hypocausts, brilliant systems where hot air was pumped through hollow spaces in the walls and floors. You sigh, the sound lost in the rustle of the straw. The Romans had clean, radiant heat, while you have a pile of burning sticks and a prayer. It's a classic example of the boring history for sleep, how a civilization can master the art of the 100-pound broadsword, but forget how to stay warm without crying. You find yourself wondering if the snails in the manuscripts were drawn in the margins because they were the only creatures that didn't need to build a fire to feel at home. They carry their insulation with them, a perfect smoke-free spiral of calcium. The sound of the camp waking up is muffled by the smoke-heavy air. You hear the low, rhythmic thump-thump of someone chopping wood for the morning meal. Each strike of the axe vibrates through the ground and into your bed, a steady, grounding pulse. You close your eyes, trying to filter out the tickle in your throat. You imagine the fire outside, the way the orange flames lick at the charred bark, the way the white ash settles like snow on the muddy ground. It's a hypnotic image. Despite the smoke, there is something deeply primal and comforting about the smell of a wood fire. It's the scent of safety, of cooked food, and of the end of a long journey. Kaksuzavan kontrengluan vivik, whether the introduction of chimneys led to the rise of privacy in the home, as people no longer had to huddle in one giant, smoky room. You like the idea of privacy, but right now, you'd trade all the privacy in the world for a room that didn't make you feel like a piece of jerky. You pull the edge of your tunic over your nose, creating a small, filtered pocket of air. The fabric smells of lavender fat and old wool, which is a significant improvement over the soot. You feel your heartbeat slowing down, sinking into the rhythm of the axeman outside. The tent is quiet now, the smoke having settled into a thin horizontal layer near the ceiling. You are floating in the space beneath it, a calm, clear pocket of stillness. The world can keep its grand inventions and its complicated ventilation. You are content to just breathe, slow and steady, in the dim gray light. The weight of the fur, the warmth of your own breath, and the distant percussive sound of the wood chopping all blend into a single drowsy sensation. You are drifting away from the fire, away from the smoke, and into a deep, ash colored dream where the air is always clear and the floor is always warm. You let your consciousness flicker like a dying ember, fading slowly into the soft, quiet dark. The morning has fully arrived, and with it comes the daily struggle of the sumptuary laws, the 14th century way of making sure you don't look more important than you actually are. You sit on the edge of your straw bed, staring at your poulain, those long, pointed leather shoes that have become the bane of your existence. It's a common historical fact that in this era, your status was measured by the inch. If you were a commoner, your shoes had to be sensible. If you were a knight, your toes could extend 6 inches beyond your foot. And if you were a duke, you could practically poke someone's eye out from across the room. You find a certain miyamai in the fact that you've survived skirmishes and sieges, yet you could be fined a month's wages simply because your footwear is 3 inches too ambitious. You slide your feet into the leather, feeling the cramped, narrow fit that modern podiatrists would use as a case study for nightmares. Historians still debate the exact origin of this fashion craze. Some say it was started by a count who wanted to hide a foot deformity, while others believe it was just the medieval version of a flex. You stand up, and for a moment, you have to perform a delicate, high stakes balancing act to avoid tripping over your own prestige. It's a little known truth that these shoes were often stuffed with moss or wool to keep the points from flopping over like a sad vegetable. You imagine a group of high ranking lords trying to have a serious political discussion while all wearing shoes that look like elongated carrots. Um, it's the kind of image that makes the boring history for sleep so much more entertaining than the history books. The air in the tent is warming up, and the smell of the leather mingles with the fading soot from the hearth. You reach for your belt, a heavy piece of leather adorned with silver studs. Even the way you fasten this is governed by social etiquette. In a world where most people can't read your resume, your clothes are your LinkedIn profile. The length of your tunic, the fabric of your hood, and even the number of buttons on your sleeves are all coded messages. You find yourself chuckling at the absurdity. You are a warrior, a man of iron and grit, yet you spend 10 minutes every morning making sure your hood is draped with the exact level of nonchalant nobility required by law. It's a heavy burden, being this fashionable. Kak Sujav and Kontreng Vivek, whether these strict dress codes were actually enforceable, or if they were just a desperate attempt by the old nobility to stop the wealthy merchant class from looking too good at parties. You suspect it's the latter. You've seen merchants in the city wearing silks that would make a bishop blush, ignoring the laws with the quiet confidence of a man with a very full purse. They are the snails of the fashion world, moving slowly, carrying their wealth, and eventually taking over the garden while the knights are busy arguing about the length of their toes. You take a tentative step toward the tent flap, the points of your shoes clicking softly against a stray wooden plank. Every movement is a chore, a slow motion performance. You realize that perhaps the boring parts of history are actually the most human. We focus on the crowns and the swords, but the real story is in the man trying not to fall on his face because his shoes are too long. There is a profound, sleepy peace in accepting this ridiculousness. You aren't a hero in an epic poem. You are a man in very silly shoes, living in a world that takes those shoes very seriously. The sunlight outside is bright and unforgiving, but for now, you linger in the shadows. You watch a small moth fluttering near a pile of discarded linen, its wings a dull, dusty brown. It doesn't have to worry about sumptuary laws or the length of its antennas. It just exists. You feel your shoulders drop, the tension of the morning's costume change finally dissipating. You decide to embrace the slow pace. If the world demands you walk like a penguin because of your status, then you will be the most dignified penguin in the kingdom. You close your eyes for a brief second, feeling the weight of the silver on your belt and the squeeze of the leather on your toes, and you let the rhythmic, muffled sounds of the camp lull you back into a state of quiet, fashionable zen. The morning light has turned a sharp, clinical white, illuminating the small wooden chest at the foot of your bed where you keep your most trusted remedies. It's a common historical fact that medieval medicine was a dizzying cocktail of genuine herbal knowledge, religious devotion, and theories that sound like they were dreamed up during a particularly intense bout of sleep deprivation. You reach for a small vial of dried mint and lavender, a simple comfort for the headache that's been pulsing behind your eyes since the smoke episode. In this world, the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, are the pillars of your existence. If you feel sluggish, you're too phlegmatic. If you're angry, you have too much choler. You find a certain miyamai in the idea that your entire personality is essentially a recipe that occasionally needs more salt or a bit less vinegar. You recall a time when a traveling physician suggested that your stiff shoulder could be cured by rubbing it with a paste made of crushed worms and honey while reciting a specific prayer to Saint Sebastian. It's a little known truth that despite the strangeness of these cures, many medieval remedies actually contained potent, naturally occurring antibiotics and antiseptics. That honey, for instance, was doing more work than the prayer was. And historians still debate the effectiveness of the medieval surgeon, who was often just the local barber with a particularly sharp set of shears. You imagine the terrifying transition from getting a quick trim to having a bad humor bled out of your arm with a leech. It makes the long-toed shoes and the smoky tents feel like a luxury spa by comparison. You look at your hand, the skin still slightly waxy from the lavender fat you applied earlier. In a way, you are your own apothecary. You know which moss helps a scrape stop stinging and which bark tea will settle a rebellious stomach. There is a quiet, rhythmic peace in this herbal wisdom, the way you have to harvest the plants at dawn when the dew is still heavy, or how the roots must be dried in the shade. It's a slow motion science. You think about the Boring History for Sleep episode on the doctrine of signatures, where people believed a plant that looked like a lung was meant to cure a cough. It's a poetic way to look at the world, even if it fed to some very questionable salads. The camp is louder now, but here in the shadows of the tent, the world of leeches and bloodletting feels far away. You find yourself focusing on the scent of the dried mint in your hand. You crush a leaf between your thumb and forefinger, releasing a sharp, cool aroma that cuts through the mustiness of the straw. It's an instant aromatic ASMR. Kaksujav and Kontrenglutenve Viek, or the things scholars still argue about, specifically how much of the placebo effect kept the medieval population going. You suspect that the sheer confidence of a man in a velvet robe telling you that a walnut would cure your brain because it looks like one was often enough to make you feel at least 10% better. You lie back down for one last moment of medical observation. Your body feels heavy, but in a balanced, temperate way. The black bile of the morning's grumpiness has been successfully countered by the cool mint. You are a masterpiece of medieval chemistry, a perfectly adjusted vessel of humors. You listen to the rhythmic thump-thump of the camp life continuing outside, and it feels like the steady, healthy pulse of the world. There is no need for leeches today, no need for crushed worms or prayers to distant saints. You have the scent of the mint, the warmth of the fur, and the soft, forgiving crunch of the straw. You close your eyes, letting the clinical white light fade into a soothing herbal green. You are drifting into a space where no one is trying to balance your bile, a quiet sanctuary of sleep where the only remedy you need is more time. You let your breath out in a long, mint-scented sigh, sinking into the dark, healing history of the earth. The harsh, clinical light has begun to surrender to the long, creeping shadows of the late afternoon, signaling the start of the final push toward the next waypoint. You find yourself back in the saddle, but the world has changed. The chaotic noise of the morning camp has been replaced by the rhythmic, muffled cadence of a column on the move. It is a common historical fact that night marches were a strategic necessity, designed to avoid the blistering heat of the sun or the prying eyes of local scouts. As you sit atop your destrier, a massive warhorse that breathes like a bellows, you feel the heavy swaying motion of the beast beneath you. The transition from the stationary world of the tent to this moving, breathing mountain of muscle is seamless. You aren't just riding the horse. You are part of a singular slow-motion engine of iron and flesh. The sun dips below the horizon, and for a few precious minutes, the world is bathed in a deep, bruised indigo. Without the orange glare of the day, your eyes begin to adjust to the true darkness of the 14th century. It's a little known truth that before the advent of gas lamps and electricity, the night was a physical presence, a thick velvet curtain that swallowed everything more than 10 paces away. You can't see the road, but you can feel it through the vibrations in the horse's legs. You navigate by the sound of the metal rings on the harness of the night in front of you, a silver, tinkling melody that acts as your only compass. It's a hypnotic, metallic ASMR that keeps your mind from wandering too far into the dark woods lining the path. You find a certain miyamai in the fact that you are a pinnacle of military power, yet you are currently following a horse's tail through the woods like a lost child. The air has turned sharp and crisp, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp stone. You look up, and the sight takes what little breath you have left. In this era, without the light pollution of 1,000 cities, the Milky Way isn't just a faint smudge. It's a brilliant, glowing river of diamonds that seems close enough to touch. Historians still debate how much the medieval world relied on celestial navigation, but as you watch the North Star hang steady over the ears of your horse, the answer feels obvious. You remember a story about how snails were said to follow the stars to find their way home, their silver trails reflecting the moonlight. You chuckle softly into your woolen scarf, the sound lost in the steady clop-clop of the hooves. Perhaps that's why the knights in the margins were so obsessed with them. They were the only creatures that knew exactly where they were going in the dark. Every few miles, the column passes a blackened silhouette of a ruined watchtower, a skeletal reminder of empires that rose and fell long before your boots touched this mud. The ruins are silent, occupied only by the owls and the ghosts of forgotten centuries. Kak Sujav and Kontrenglot ve Viek, or the things scholars still argue about, specifically how much of the Dark Ages were actually dark, or if people simply learned to see better in the shadows. You suspect it's the latter. You can see the faint glint of moonlight on a distant stream, the way the frost is beginning to silver the edges of the leaves, and the subtle shift in the horse's ears when it hears a fox in the underbrush. Your senses are heightened, tuned to a frequency that the noisy, bright world of the day can't reach. The cold is starting to bite through your leather gloves, making your fingers feel stiff and wooden. You adjust your grip on the reins, and the leather creaking in the stillness. There is no talking now. The commanders have called for silence. The only sounds are the rhythmic breathing of the horses, the occasional clank of a scabbard against a stirrup, and the wind sighing through the ancient oaks. It's a deeply meditative state. You feel yourself drifting, your consciousness expanding to fill the vast, starlit space around you. You aren't a knight on a mission. You are just a heartbeat in the dark, moving through a landscape that doesn't care about your titles or your wars. The world feels ancient and infinitely large. You think about the boring history for sleep segment on the music of the spheres, the idea that the planets made a celestial harmony as they turned. You can almost hear it now, a low, humming vibration that resonates in your very bones. The swaying of the horse, the rhythm of the march, and the cold, clear air all conspire to pull you into a state of total, heavy relaxation. You are tired, yes, but it is a clean, honest exhaustion. You let your chin drop toward your chest, the heavy wool of your cloak providing a warm, private sanctuary. The stars continue their slow, silent rotation above, and you continue your slow, silent journey below. You are part of the night now, a ghost in armor, drifting through the quiet history of a world that is finally, mercifully, asleep. The rhythmic swaying of your horse finally slows to a halt as the first faint pearlescent glow of dawn begins to outline the silhouette of a distant abbey. Your journey through the mud, the armor, and the strange, snail-infested margins of the medieval mind is reaching its natural conclusion. As you dismount, your legs feel like heavy pillars of stone, and the ground feels remarkably solid beneath your long-toed shoes. It's a common historical fact that the life of a knight was a cycle of extreme exertion, followed by periods of profound, heavy stillness. You lean against the cold stone wall of the abbey, feeling the ancient masonry draw the remaining heat from your shoulders. The Miyamai of your existence is that after all the metal and the posturing, all you really want is a quiet corner and a blanket that doesn't smell like a battlefield. You look down at the base of the wall and see a single snail, its shell a perfect, dusty spiral, making its way across a patch of moss. It doesn't look like a monster anymore. It looks like a weary traveler who has finally reached home. Historians still debate whether the medieval period truly ended with a bang or a slow, quiet fade into the Renaissance. But as you watch the sun begin to warm the damp earth, it feels like a very gentle transition. You realize that you have carried your own shell, your armor, your duty, your history through the dark, and now it is time to set it down. A little known truth about the end of an era is that it rarely feels like an ending. It just feels like the beginning of a very long, very necessary nap. The world around you is softening. The sharp edges of the lances, the cold bite of the steel, and the heavy weight of the four humors are all dissolving into a warm, golden haze. You find a small alcove within the abbey's cloisters, a space where the air is still and the only sound is the distant, rhythmic chanting of the monks starting their morning prayers. It's the ultimate ASMR, a low, melodic vibration that seems to smooth out the wrinkles in your soul. You wrap your heavy cloak around yourself, the wool finally soft and dry. Each breath you take is slower than the last, a quiet surrender to the peace of the stone. The images of the last few days, the knights fighting mollusks, the smell of lavender fat, the smoky tents, and the starlit marches are becoming faint and distant, like ink fading on old parchment. You aren't a warrior of the 14th century anymore. You are just a part of the quiet, dusty layers of time. Kaksuja vun kontren lot vek, whether we ever truly leave the past behind, but as you close your eyes, you know the answer. The past is just a dream we all share, a slow-moving story that carries us toward the light. You feel the heavy velvet curtain of sleep finally falling, thick and warm, over everything you've seen and done. The light of the new day is gentle, filtering through the arched windows and casting long, soft shadows across the floor. You are safe. You are warm. The snails have retreated into the shade, and the rabbits have put away their mallets. The history books are closing their heavy covers, and the ink is finally dry. You let your thoughts drift away like a single silver trail of slime on a leaf, vanishing into the green. Everything is quiet. Everything is still. Sleep now, and let the weight of the ages pull you down into a deep, peaceful rest. The world will turn without you for a while. The stars will keep their rhythm, and the earth will keep its secrets. You are just a heartbeat in the great, silent hall of time.